There are two topics in particular, emotions really, that most people find pretty difficult to talk about. And along this healing journey, it can bring up a lot. And today I want to talk about one in particular. But those two things are grief and shame. And how do you grieve something that you never actually had? Welcome, I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks so much for joining me. This is something that comes up, I would say virtually with everybody. How do you grieve something that you never actually had? And in all reality, when it comes to healing childhood trauma, that is the majority of grief that you experience. That is where the majority of loss tends to come from, grieving something that you never actually had. Because the things that you didn't have that you're going to be grieving are things that you should have had. They're things that should have been rightfully yours, that you should have been able to trust in, have experience with. There is so much loss that comes from experiencing childhood trauma. So many different ways in your life that loss can show up. And inevitably, people will often talk about how they don't really understand how you grieve something that you never actually had. And I think it makes a lot of sense, right? How do you grieve something that you haven't had? Because we tend to think of grief and loss as actually losing something, right? Like if you don't ever have money, you can't lose it. If you don't ever have a particular job, then you can't lose it. But there are some things in life that, particularly as children, that should just automatically, naturally be a part of our experience for all humans. And when you don't get to have that or experience it, you are losing out on oftentimes some really fundamental things that children not only should be able to experience, but often need to be able to experience. And so when you're healing and you're moving through grief and loss, you're grieving the loss of that secure attachment, of that safety, of various experiences that you didn't get to fully engage in because you were too anxious, too depressed, too scared, too independent. So there's a lot of loss that we experience as childhood trauma survivors. There really is. And grieving that loss, the freedom, the safety, the secure attachment, the feeling fully grounded that you're enough and that you're loved no matter what. Children deserve that. Children need that to develop secure attachment as young people, to develop a really strong sense of self. That is such a big part of what helps children feel safe in the world, safe within themselves, safe enough to be willing to try different things, take different kinds of reasonable risks, because they're grounded in that truth, in that safety, in that trust within themselves and the world around them. And when you experience childhood trauma, all of that is broke. All of that is lost. And for us as humans, allowing ourselves to feel the emotion that comes from profound grief and from shame, but we're talking about grief today, allowing ourselves to really feel that. It's not easy. It's natural that we want to push that away. And if you think about aside from childhood trauma, but when you just think about somebody who maybe has lost a partner or a child, even a parent or a friend, their grieving process can be kind of complicated. Grieving in general is complicated. But part of the reason that we as humans struggle so much with grief is because we try to shut down some of the emotional experiences that come with grief. So we push it to the side, but then we never really get the opportunity to move through that grief and get to a place where we can feel the love and the sadness and even the joy and the grief. If we don't allow ourselves to move through it, we can never get to the place where we can trust that we do have the capacity to hold all of it. So things kind of get stuck and you are kind of numb, or you can't talk or think about that person because it just brings up too much that you don't want to feel. So when you are on the emotional healing journey, particularly from childhood trauma, particularly interpersonal trauma, so when the trauma happened as a result of somebody else doing something to you, and the closer that relationship, the more loss there is going to be. Because if it's a stranger, you don't have an expectation that that person is going to keep you safe necessarily. Although as a child, you should be able to trust that everybody will keep you safe. With a friend's brother, you don't necessarily have to rely on that person. You could potentially never see that person again. But if it's somebody that's close to you, somebody that you see regularly, somebody that lives in your home, there's going to be a lot more loss because the impact on your everyday life is going to be more significant in terms of having to see that person or avoid that person, the fear, are they going to come home today? All those kinds of things. So when you are on this healing journey, being able to acknowledge and honor the reality of that loss is an important part of healing. Because when you are not honoring that, whether it's kind of a deliberate thing, even if it's self-protective, saying, well, I didn't need that anyway, or I was better off, or I'm grateful for it, or however that might look, or you just push it to the side and completely avoid it, you are telling that little girl or little boy inside of you that her or his pain doesn't matter. You're telling that little girl or boy that it's not a big deal, that they shouldn't be bothered. And we worry about hearing that in our regular lives. Many have heard that from people when they've shared different pieces of their experience. It's not a big deal. You should be over it. But that's exactly what we're doing to that little one inside of us when we deny or minimize that reality. And so when we're on this healing journey, being able to acknowledge, honor, and validate the reality of what it means to have lost that. And that is the grieving that you need to do. And what you have lost, again, is a lot of people will say they lost their innocence. I don't use that word because I think it can have a connotation that you as an individual are no longer innocent, and I don't believe that. But you do lose your sense of freedom. From the very first time something happens, you are no longer able to feel free in your body or in your life. And there may be degrees of freedom that you feel here or there, but you never feel fully safe and trusting within yourself. And that is a huge, huge loss. and being able to honor that reality and what that means to a child, whether you are 2 or 12 or 16 or 18 or even older, especially if you had childhood trauma. There is so much loss in that. And then if it's somebody close to you, somebody like within your household, there's the loss of that relationship. If it's a parent, that parent is supposed to love you unconditionally and protect you, and you're supposed to be able to feel so incredibly safe with that person, safer than anywhere else in your life. And if that person betrayed you, particularly in such a significant way, that sense of safety is gone. The belief that this person loves you in a full and complete, healthy way is gone. Now, you may say to yourself different things to try to make yourself believe that it's there so that you can hold on to it. That's part of how we cope and how we protect ourselves. And there's nothing wrong with that. But in reality, on an energetic level, that sense of safety and trust is gone. And what it means to a child to lose that in their life, to not have that, is so incredibly damaging. And not just on an emotional, general level, but so incredibly damaging to our sense of self and who we are in the world, and certainly what we're worthy of. What that loss means in terms of how you go out and engage in the world, whether you're going into kindergarten or high school or college or your first romantic relationship, and even friendships. Experiencing that loss influences all your other relationships, potentially to varying degrees, depending on the nature of the relationship. But the more vulnerable the relationship, the more impact. The more that loss is going to show up within you and therefore within that relationship. Being able to believe in yourself as being good enough, being able to trust yourself and your intuition and what you want, because it creates so much conflict within us. And so much of healing is healing those losses. And that's why grieving the things that we didn't have is sometimes even more significant than grieving for loss of things that we did have. Now, I don't want to say that one is more important than the other, because there's a lot of things that we can lose in our lives, particularly as children, that can be incredibly devastating. But when it comes to healing, because of the ways that we've coped in terms of denial and rationalization and minimizing, that's where a lot of that grief is going to come from. And you likely, there's a good chance that you have not ever been able to really even see that there's grief within all of that, because you've learned how to cope with that very well. May not look well in terms of the behaviors, because some of the ways of coping may not be very healthy, but you've been quite successful at using those ways of coping, whatever those ways of coping are, as a way to not feel that loss. And there's, again, nothing to be ashamed of in that, nothing to feel bad about. And I'm sharing this in part because it is something really difficult to be able to acknowledge, and certainly incredibly difficult to feel into. Because often there is emotion that ends up coming up. And the harder you try to push it away, the more unhealthy ways it tends to show up. Sometimes there's tears. Sometimes there's anger. Sometimes there's more ongoing denial, just like the entire grief process in general. But when you allow yourself to kind of face that loss or those losses, then you're able to actually kind of open that door, so to speak, to the healing that your heart needs. Anybody who has experienced childhood trauma has experienced a pretty significant amount of loss. Even if it was like just a pretty bad car accident that was trauma in childhood, that's likely going to be something that you carry with you for a while, even if nobody was like really seriously injured. The difference, though, is that if there is a car accident as a child, there's a good chance that the people around you are talking about it. There's a good chance that if you're upset, that assuming that you're in a relatively healthy environment, which many of you may not be or may not have been. I certainly really wasn't. But it doesn't even have to be all that healthy, as long as if there is space for you to have emotion about the car accident, then you get the ability to process some of that, which is very different than certainly for most of you, than experiencing childhood trauma, particularly sexual trauma, that you kept to yourself, that nobody ever knew about, because then there is no ability to process. In fact, the only processing that's happening is in your own mind about how it's your fault, or how you're being punished, or how this person doesn't love you, or that this is what love is, or the many things that we tell ourselves as ways of coping with it. That's the only conversation that's happening about it. And we know that that is not helpful. That's what reinforces those false beliefs about who we believe we are. With support, when you are able to move through, to acknowledge the loss, and you give yourself the space to move through it, it truly isn't as bad as most people anticipate that it will be. I'm not saying it's not bad. I'm not saying it's not hard. I'm not saying that you will even be glad that you did it. On the other side, I think you will be. But you have protected yourself from feeling all of that for so long. Allowing the space for yourself to go into that now. It's not easy. But the feelings that you have around it now are coming when you're in a place in time, hopefully where you have support, and you're more grounded in your kind of power, in a sense. Because if you're on this healing journey, you've decided to take that power back. Now, you may not feel like you have power. You might feel completely out of control. But again, with support and with your acknowledgement that there's healing to do, that gives you a little bit more groundedness as you work through that loss. So I hope that this helps. I hope that it helps you recognize that really just for an acknowledgement, for your heart to be acknowledged, that your struggle, the heartache that you feel, the sadness that maybe sometimes comes out of nowhere, seemingly, comes out of nowhere. That maybe it really isn't out of nowhere. Maybe there's something that's just kind of touched on some aspect of that loss. Holidays, birthdays, yours or theirs, or somebody else that was in your life at the time. Those are times when, on a subconscious level, those things can come up fairly easily. Times of year, sometimes there's lots of things that can bring that loss up a little bit without us having any awareness that that's what is present for us. And that's why it is so important to be able to acknowledge, to recognize those various losses so that you can move through it and get the healing that you and your heart deserve. Thanks so much for watching. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you haven't yet subscribed, make sure to do so and click the bell for notifications. And of course, if you found this helpful, please make sure to give it a thumbs up so other people can more easily find it. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.